Yeah, I think we touched on literalism, and that's something that you have a bit of a bugbear about. This kind of this journey we've gone on, and it potentially even possibly trace as far back as Aristotle, because he left out some of the teachings of Plato, didn't he? And perhaps if you could talk about how you've brought Greek philosophy into this work, because that would obviously be of interest to our members being philosophers. That would be
Oh,
cool.
right. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, no, my philosophy is extremely shallow and sketchy. I only read the bits of Plato that I liked.
Mm.
Timaeus,
Same here.
Phaedrus, I did read The Republic, but, quite a lot
Mm.
of it I found quite boring. Um, um, I was more interested in the way Platonism was developed, 1,000 years later by Plotinus
Mm.
and Iamblichus and who else? Plutarch, yeah, Proclus.
Yeah. S-
And they're very on board. And I was especially taken with Plotinus's notion that the entire cosmos is built on, organized by soul.
Mm.
This chimed very well with my notion that which was a development of Plato's notion of the soul of the world, which is woven through the cosmos after the demiurge has created everything. And I immediately saw that the soul of the world was sort of congruent with um, Jung's collective unconscious. He was the big influence in my life. You see, my background, I have no philosophical training at all, and I find all philosophy difficult to read. I don't like abstractions and so on. But when you get someone like Jung, who was pretty well versed in philosophy, but it seemed to me he was dealing with the real nuts and bolts of the human psyche,
Mm.
And his model of the psyche was one that appealed to me. There are others, but his seemed to me the deepest, the most full of potential and indeed the most imaginative. But I could see that just as the daimons live in the soul of the world, so his own archetypes inhabit the collective unconscious. And for me, the bridge between them was the romantic idea of imagination, which I was already familiar with through reading Romantic poets, and to some extent a smattering of the German Romantic thinkers. Like I read some Schelling early on and some Schiller, and gave up on Fichte. But so then I saw a chain, a continuity. The idea of the soul of the world was developed by the Neoplatonists. It then went underground until it was rediscovered at the Renaissance by Ficino, who was so enamored of their notion of an ensouled universe, and that imagination, being the chief faculty of the soul, was therefore the most important thing.
Mm.
That in Florence, Ficino held sway in his little academy in imitation of Plato's, and when I read about that from the writers at the Courtauld Institute and so on, not the Courtauld, what's the other one? Doesn't matter. Um, I could see at once that this was where the Romantics got a lot of their ideas from. They got it from the Renaissance. Coleridge, in particular, was extremely well read and had read Jacob Boehme, who was a late Renaissance figure, who also thought that imagination was the ground of reality. And and so it all began to make sense. And I began to see dimly that there was an esoteric tradition, not well publicized, not mainstream particularly,
Mm.
in which imagination, instead of, for example, reason, was the chief faculty of the soul. Indeed, I use the words soul and imagination almost interchangeably. Um, a, a tradition which just burst through occasionally into the mainstream, as it did in Alexandria in the second and third centuries AD, as it did in Florence during the Renaissance, as it did in Germany and in England during the Romantic period, and then was revived again, reinvented by Jung and by my own favorite mentor, W.B. Yeats, who was very who was in that golden chain, as the alchemists called it.
Mm.
So that's sort of the schema, you know. So I put those things together and wrote my book, The Philosopher's Secret Fire. The title, of course, is drawn from alchemy, and alchemy was my great initiation into the other world, into another way of thinking, which completely turned upside down my modern scientific naturalistic worldview.
Mm.
Um, yeah, I'm sure. I think that's probably all irrelevant to what you asked me, Matt.
No, not at all. This is absolutely fantastic. This is precisely what I want to hear. This is because I'm curious. I mean, you touched on this in Philosopher's Secret Fire, where you talked about the way that this, you know, the other world was sort of located inside us, inside our sort of subconscious, if you like. But actually, you know, the likes of Jung are suggesting, well, no, there's an objectivity here. This is beyond the individual. You know, it's a place that we can visit,
Yes.
whether through dreams or initiatory ceremonies and so on and so forth. And that's what I'm you know, and I think philosophy should be interested in this kind of stuff because I mean, as you said earlier, that if you leave out the you know big chunks of actual human visceral experience, you're not doing philosophy. Well, where's the love of wisdom in that? You know, and
Yes.
so
Yes.
I like to think I don't. I mean, I'm optimistic generally in the main, and I think that we're on a journey of some sort of awakening at the moment, and I'm seeing it in science, I'm seeing it in philosophy. There's a you know, I mean, there's a growing movement around the Hermetic idealism. There's a friend of mine, Stephen Wallard, runs a group online of which I'm a member, and we're looking through the Hermetic principles and trying to sort of map them into a modern scientific or philosophical worldview, and it's interesting stuff.
Very
Um,
interesting. Yes, that's very
yeah.
interesting. But of the sort of major kind of points at which the imaginative tradition breaks into the mainstream, all those people in that tradition were happy with the daimonics.
Mm,
You know, they were romantic poets were quite happy with fairies, just as the Neoplatonists were happy with daimons.
mm,
Jung, famously, I mean, well, his Red Book revealed that he was talking to daimons the whole time. You know, I
mm,
mean, he had an amazing relationship with daimonic powers.
mm. Didn't
And
Socrates had one that famously went silent when he was
yes,
offered the hemlock, didn't it? And I think that was his
yes,
signal
yes.
to say, "No, I'm just going to take the hemlock."
He didn't say no, which is what his daimon always said. Yes.